Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Javad Nehami and these are the headlines. In India, police have detained 200 people following Tuesday's massive protest against new agricultural laws in New Delhi. Farmer unions blame the government for the Republic Day violence, which left one person dead. They vow to continue their protest until the new laws are repealed. In Cameroon, 53 people have died and 21 others injured after a bus collided with a truck in the western part of the country. Local officials say the collision caused a fire which ravaged the two vehicles. In Lebanon, at least 45 people have been injured during protests against a coronavirus lockdown that has worsened their economic woes. The angry protesters pelted government offices with stones and blocked a main square in Tripoli. A round-the-clock curfew is in force nationwide as Lebanon recorded over 285,000 COVID-19 cases with more than 2,470 deaths. The global number of coronavirus cases has crossed 100 million, while the death toll has reached over 2.15 million. The worst-hit country, the US, accounts for over a quarter of the global infections with over 25.4 million cases. India has the world's second highest caseload with over 10.6 million infections, followed by Brazil's more than 8.9 million cases. Pakistan has registered over 1,500 new cases and 74 deaths overnight, with a toll crossing 11,400. In cricket, Pakistan leads South Africa by 88 runs in the first innings of the first test at the National Stadium in Karachi. The hosts ended the second day at 308 for 8, with Fawad Alam scoring a brilliant century. For South Africa, Kagiso Rabada and Keshav Maharaj bagged 2 wickets each. Those are the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. In India, police have detained 200 people following Tuesday's massive protest against agricultural reforms in New Delhi. Farmers' unions accuse the government of provoking the Republic Day violence, which left one protester dead. They have also vowed to continue their protest until the new laws are repealed. Tens of thousands of farmers have been protesting on the outskirts of New Delhi since November. This is one of the longest farmers-led movement India has ever seen. Meanwhile, in New York, Sikh demonstrators gathered outside the Indian consulate in solidarity with India's protesting farmers.
All the bills are for the farmers, and what we want is to take it back. There's hundreds of thousands of people that are in today's rally that are protesting to get back what we want. We want the MST to drop how it was before. We want the Mandi system to come back as well. And here we are in front of the Indian embassy to have the same thing, what we want from India. We want our rights. We want them to take back what they approved, which the farmers haven't approved at all.
India's ties with its neighboring countries are worsening with each passing day. The latest in the row is Nepal's Foreign Minister Pradeep Kumar Gyawali, who was denied a meeting by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He was in India on a 3-day visit to attend the 6th India-Nepal Joint Commission meeting. Gyawali stressed the need to resolve territorial disputes with India. He also dismissed India's concerns about Chinese influence in Nepal. Modi's refusal to meet Gyawali shows India's displeasure over Nepal's inclusion of disputed areas into its new map. The growing ties between Nepal and China are also worrying New Delhi. A complete shutdown is being observed in the Kupwara district of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Kashmiris are remembering the victims of a massacre carried out by Indian troops in 1994. On this day in 1994, Indian troops killed 27 civilians to punish the people for observing a shutdown on the Indian Republic Day. All shops and other business establishments are closed with traffic suspended. Meanwhile, Pakistan's government says Prime Minister Imran Khan will address a public rally on Kashmir Solidarity Day on February the 5th. He will speak in Kotali district near the line of control. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says Islamabad shares historic ties with Kuwait. He said this during a meeting with a Kuwaiti delegation led by Deputy Foreign Minister for Asian Affairs Ali Suleiman As-Said in Islamabad. Qureshi hailed Kuwait's diplomatic efforts to resolve disputes between Gulf countries. The visiting dignitary said Kuwait attaches great importance to its brotherly ties with Pakistan. The two sides also agreed to bolster bilateral cooperation. They also exchanged views on overall regional situation and the developments regarding the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The Taliban have discussed the regional security situation with the chairman of the Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani. In a tweet, a Taliban spokesperson, Mohammad Naeem, said the delegation led by Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar also discussed the intra-Afghan talks. He said the border issues between Tehran and Kabul, as well as the problems of the Afghan refugees in Iran, were also discussed. The spokesperson said both the sides exchanged views on strengthening relations between Tehran and Kabul. Naeem said the delegation will also meet with a number of other high-ranking Iranian officials. He said the Taliban will take necessary steps to ensure good and lasting relations between the two countries. Iran says it is the U.S. who should make the first goodwill move to save the 2015 nuclear deal. Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif says Iran stood firm against 4 years of U.S. economic terrorism imposed in violation of the deal and the UNSC resolution. In a tweet, Zarif said it was the U.S. that broke the deal for no reason. He said Washington must remedy what it did wrong and then Iran will respond. Meanwhile, Israel's Defense Forces Chief Lieutenant General Aviv Kochavi has warned the U.S. return to the deal will be a mistake. Kochavi said strategically the return to the JCPOA will presumably lead to the region nuclearization of the Middle East. Iran's Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif has stressed the need for respecting international law and rights of minorities. He said this during a meeting with Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. Zarif said Tehran aims to continue its contacts with Yerevan for future cooperation and peace in the region. Earlier, Zarif met with Armenia's Foreign Minister Ara Avazian. The two sides discussed bilateral ties and regional issues, with Zarif saying the two countries are good neighbors. The Iranian foreign minister has already visited Baku and Moscow as part of a regional visit. A UN report has found the Yemeni government and the Houthi rebels guilty of money laundering and corruption. The annual report to the UN Security Council on the implementation of the sanctions says the malpractice adversely affected access to the food supplies. The report says the Houthis also collected at least $1.8 billion as state revenue in 2019 to help fund its war effort. It adds Saudi Arabia deposited $2 billion with Yemen's central bank in 2018 under a development program. However, it says the bank laundered a substantial part of the deposit in a sophisticated money laundering scheme. The UN has recently warned that Yemen is on the verge of a large-scale famine with millions of civilians at risk. Israeli forces have demolished a mosque and several other structures in the occupied West Bank. According to a UN report, Israel razed over 500 Palestinian structures in 2020 alone. This Israeli action comes a day after the US announced it will restore relations with Palestine. US acting envoy to the UN said the US intends to restore aid for Palestine and reopen its diplomatic office in Washington. Richard Mills also said that normalizing ties with Israel isn't a substitute for Israeli-Palestinian peace. The lower house of the Russian parliament has ratified the extension of New START nuclear arms control treaty. This comes after Russia and the US struck a deal to extend the New START nuclear arms control treaty. The Kremlin has said President Vladimir Putin and his US counterpart Joe Biden discussed the issue over a phone call. In a statement, it said the two leaders expressed satisfaction over the exchange of diplomatic notes between their countries. Meanwhile, the White House said the two sides agreed to discuss a range of arms control and emerging security issues. It said Biden also raised the issue of Moscow's alleged meddling in US election and a massive cyber espionage campaign. Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for a greater dialogue with the European Union. This comes amid strained relations between the West and Moscow over the treatment of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. At the World Economic Forum, Putin stressed the need for more positive agenda to improve trade. Russia has accused Western countries of encouraging rallies in support of jailed opposition leader Navalny. Earlier, Putin described last week's pro-Navalny protests as illegal and dangerous. Despite calls from the Baltic countries, the EU has so far held off from imposing fresh sanctions on Russia. Meanwhile, Britain says it is keeping any further sanctions on Moscow over Navalny's detention under review. Co-chair of Syria peace talks has warned if concrete results of the dialogue are not obtained in a short time, the process will falter. Speaking at the end of the second day of the talks in Geneva, Hadi al-Bahra said participants should not put obstacles in the progress of the dialogue. Without naming anyone, he said the most important feature of the talks is the attitude of all the parties to the constitutional process. Al-Bahra said the delegates should show willingness for the full implementation of a UN Security Council resolution for the talks to succeed. The 5-day Syrian Constitutional Committee talks are convened by the UN to form the basic principles of the Syrian constitution. Tunisia's parliament has approved the cabinet reshuffle amid violent protests. Tunis Prime Minister Hisham Meshishi named 11 new ministers, saying he hopes it will inject new blood into his government. He said the young people protesting outside the parliament reminds the administration to keep its priorities straight. The Prime Minister said the protests are legitimate and the government will listen to the angry youth. However, President Kais Saied indicated he would reject the reshuffle. He also condemned the absence of women among the new ministers. Meanwhile, the riot police opened water cannon on protesters outside the parliament who rallied against social inequality and police abuses. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. US President Joe Biden has reaffirmed his commitment to strengthening transatlantic security. In a statement, the White House said Biden held a telephonic conversation with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. It said the president conveyed his intention to work with allies in Afghanistan, Iraq and Russia. The statement said Biden reaffirmed Washington's commitment to collective defense under the North Atlantic Treaty. It added, the president thanked the NATO chief for his steadfast leadership of the alliance. He also emphasized the significance of shared values and consultation to strengthen deterrence and counter emerging threats. A U.S. federal judge has temporarily blocked President Joe Biden's 100-day freeze on migrant deportations. The decision has once again put the future of thousands of immigrants from across the world, especially South America, in limbo.
The Texas judge's temporary restraining order blocks the policy for 14 days nationwide. Earlier, the state of Texas filed a complaint saying it would face irreparable harm if the deportation freeze took effect. The Biden administration is expected to appeal the ruling. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden has signed an executive order aimed at promoting racial equality. The order scales back the government's use of private prisons and bolsters anti-discrimination enforcement in the housing market. Talking to reporters, Biden stressed the need to open the promise of America to every American.
I believe this nation and this government need to change their whole approach to the issue of racial equity. Yes, we need criminal justice reform, but that isn't nearly enough. We need to open the promise of America to every American. And that means we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole of government.
Elsewhere, the U.S. State Department said Biden administration will also thoroughly review U.S. sanctions on the International Criminal Court officials.
The U.S. Senate has blocked an attempt to halt former President Donald Trump's impeachment trial, but a conviction now looks unlikely as only 5 Republicans joined the Democrats in rejecting the motion. Republican Senator Rand Paul forced a vote on whether the trial is unconstitutional because Trump is no longer president. Paul presented the point of order after lawmakers were sworn in as jurors for the trial proceedings. The Democratic-led Senate blocked the motion in a 55-45 vote. Talking to media, Kentucky Senator Paul said votes meant the impeachment trial was dead on arrival. Democrats required the support of 17 Republicans to convict Trump on the charge of incitement of insurrection. The global number of new coronavirus cases has crossed 100 million, while the death toll exceeds 2.15 million. The worst hit country, US, accounts for over a quarter of the global infections with over 25.4 million cases. India is the world's second highest caseload with over 10.6 million infections, followed by Brazil's more than 8.9 million cases. More in this report.
As the world crossed the 100 million COVID-19 cases, the leaders of even the most developed countries have nothing to offer but half-baked apologies over the mishandling and faltering social-political infrastructures. In Europe, Portugal's government is considering the transfer of COVID-19 patients abroad as oxygen supply system of a large hospital near Lisbon failed from overuse. AstraZeneca's chief executive says the United Kingdom comes first for vaccines as he rejected calls to divert the doses to the European Union. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has urged the EU to not restrict the vaccine supply. As the United Kingdom's death toll exceeded 100,000 mark, Johnson said he takes full responsibility for what unfolded in Britain's fight against the virus.
As Prime Minister, I take full responsibility for everything that the government has done. What I can tell you is that we truly did everything we could and continue to do everything that we can to minimise loss of life and to minimise suffering in what has been a very, very difficult stage and a very, very difficult crisis for our country, and we will continue to do that, just as every government that is affected by this crisis around the world is continuing to do the same.
Japan's Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga has apologized for an inadequate medical response to COVID-19 patients due to the country's strained health system. Over in the Americas, tribes leaders in the Amazon rainforest have urged the Brazilian government to ensure vaccine rollouts reach all of its communities. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden says the country's vaccine program is in worse shape than anticipated as he announced to purchase 200 million more doses.
After a review of the current vaccine supply and manufacturing plans, I can announce that we will increase overall weekly vaccination distributions to states, tribes, and territories from 8.6 million doses to a minimum of 10 million doses. Starting next week, that's an increase of 1.4 million doses per week.
Public frustration and anger against COVID-19 restrictions continue to grow across the world as economic strife intensifies. Though Dutch cities witnessed relative calm after 3 days of anti-lockdown riots, over in Lisbon, hundreds of protesters clashed with soldiers as they said nationwide lockdown is increasing their poverty.
In Lebanon, at least 45 people have been injured during clashes between security forces and the demonstrators angered by a coronavirus lockdown. They pelted government offices with stones and blocked a main square in Tripoli. A round-the-clock curfew is in force nationwide as Lebanon recorded over 285,000 COVID-19 cases with more than 2,470 deaths. The protesters say the lockdown has worsened their economic woes. Tripoli was already one of the Lebanon's poorest areas even before the pandemic piled on new misery to a chronic economic crisis. The army has been deployed to contain the rioters. Pakistan's National Command and Operations Center against the coronavirus has formulated a comprehensive vaccination strategy. In a statement, NCOC said the strategy includes 8 steps and was formed after consultation with all the provinces and stakeholders. It said Pakistan's National Immunization Management System will operate through National Vaccine Administration and Coordination Cell. It said the management system is mostly digital with very little human interference. Meanwhile, Pakistan has recorded 74 deaths and 1,563 infections in the last 24 hours. The national death toll has reached to 11,450, while the infections have surged to over 537,000. Bangladesh is preparing to move 2,000 to 3,000 more Rohingya refugees to the remote island of Bhasan Char this week. A Navy officer in charge of the island said the refugees will be taken to Chittagong and then to Bhasan Char. Bangladesh has already relocated about 3,500 of the refugees to the island since early December. Authorities justify the move to the island, saying overcrowding in the camps in Cox's Bazar is leading to crimes. But refugees and humanitarian workers say the migrants had been coerced into going. Bangladesh hosts over 1 million Rohingya refugees from Myanmar who are living in camps rife with COVID-19. 2 people have been killed amid the violence in the Chattogram City Corporation election. The police say a pedestrian was killed in a gunfight between supporters of 2 rival candidates. Police say the killed person was a construction worker caught in the middle of the armed confrontation. Another man was killed during altercation with his brother over the rival groups they supported. Meanwhile, the police said at least 25 others sustained injuries during violence at polling centers. They have also detained one of the candidates while polling has been postponed at 4 centers. In Cameroon, 53 people have died and 21 others injured after a bus collided with a truck in the western part of the country. Officials say the accident occurred in Sancho village when a speeding truck ran into a 70-seat bus. They said the bus was transporting passengers from the city of Dola to Bafoussam. A local governor said the collision caused a fire which ravaged the 2 vehicles and the occupants. However, the truck driver fled the scene and the authorities have launched a manhunt to nab him. The UN says over 175,000 people have been affected by the cyclone and flooding in Mozambique. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs put the number of displaced people at 8,000. It said food, drinking water, hygiene kits and COVID-19 prevention materials are urgently needed. The World Food Programme said nearly 3 million people in Mozambique's rural and urban areas are facing high levels of food insecurity, while the International Organization for Migration remains concerned over patients who have lost medication in cyclone. On Tuesday, the death toll across the region rose to 14 after South Africa reported 1 more death. Argentina and Chile have called for closer relations between the Latin American nations. Argentine President Alberto Fernandez is visiting Chile to bolster the bilateral ties. Fernandez and his Chilean counterpart, Sebastián Piñera, signed 3 agreements in the areas of health and the border. The 2 leaders agreed on joint efforts to better fight the coronavirus pandemic. Fernandez called for a more united Latin America to fight the pandemic that has severely struck the region.
Sometimes I think that if we had been closer and more united, surely we could have coped better. Well, that time has passed. Now is the opportunity to come and take advantage of the experience that the pandemic has left us to understand the importance of development and unity among Argentines, Chileans, and also among Latin Americans.
And in Afghanistan, the country's first female breakdancer, Maniza Talash, has set her sights on the Paris Olympics in 2024. Breakdancing is one of the latest sports to be admitted to the Olympics. More in this report.
At a gym in downtown Kabul, Maniza Talash and her teammates jump and sway to the beat, working up a sweat breakdancing and doing head spins. When she first joined the breakdancing club about 2.5 months ago, there were no girls there. Now, 5 other girls have followed her lead.
This is a new and different profession, and the club did not have a female member when I first joined. I was very interested in breakdancing, and when I became aware that it has come to Afghanistan and its members are all nice people from my own country, I joined this club to introduce this profession to other people. In general, I want to be different.
The club, founded by a few local breakers a year ago, now has over 30 members. They train 3 days a week to learn the finer points of a dance style that has evolved into a sport, hoping one day to compete in the Olympics. Apart from having to overcome social hurdles, the Lash has to brace for tough physical training, but she is determined.
This is very tough, and you have to have a strong physique to learn and do it. For example, standing on one hand and holding the whole body weight on it is not easy. But nothing is easy. You can learn and achieve the goal.
Breakdancing, an art form which was born on the streets of New York City in the 1970s, was among 4 sports, along with skateboarding, sports climbing, and surfing, that the International Olympics Committee agreed recently to add in the Paris Games in 2024 to attract a younger, more urban audience.
In Egypt, you can get your vaccine and eat it too. For an aspiring baker has made a cake resembling a vaccine vial, which she delivered to coronavirus patients at a Cairo hospital. More in this report.
Egyptian baker Amy Izzat is a woman on a mission. She knows the population is suffering from pandemic fatigue, so she's delivering hope and happiness to patients fighting the coronavirus in the form of cake. The gray and white cake has the words coronavirus vaccine glued on top with edible sugar sheets and fondant. It is meant to give patients a glimmer of hope that the pandemic will soon be over, especially now when the countries around the world have started vaccinating their populations.
I got the idea of making this cake as it's now been a year since the coronavirus pandemic started, and now the vaccine is being distributed around the world. I like to do this cake to give hope to patients fighting the virus, something to make them happy, something as simple as this to give them hope and make them happy. I hope the future will be better.
The baker has boxed and delivered the cake to the May 15 hospital in Cairo's Helvan neighborhood, which is being used as a quarantine hospital. The 3-layer vanilla sponge cake filled with raspberry cream with chocolate ganache coating took 3 days to make and decorate.
This cake took around 3 days for me to make. I baked it, added the filling, decorated it to look like a vial, and then used edible sugar sheets that people can eat for the writing.
Egypt has a record of more than 160,000 COVID-19 cases and nearly 9,000 deaths to date. Health officials say the real number of infections is likely to be much higher because of the low testing rate and exclusion of private testing results from official figures.
The annual Paris Haute Couture Week is being held virtually as the COVID-19 pandemic bars public catwalk shows. The event kicked off on Monday in the French capital, with brands replacing the runway with online manifestations. More in this report.
French fashion designer Julien Fournier first learned to wield a pair of scissors, then to design a dress on an iPad. Now the pandemic has forced him to pick up a new skill as a movie director. Paris Haute Couture Week is normally a riot of catwalk shows, usually packed with editors, buyers, and influencers. But not this year. Fournier spent 3 days shooting a 9-minute and 30-second film in his workshop. Pandemic has not just made designers reinvent. Fournier says customers now want less extravagant designs.
Non, il y a toujours des fêtes.
There are still parties, some weddings, but it all becomes more private, more contained with all the social distancing that we know. So these women also want clothes more high quality, more haute couture, so they also reinvent their way to show off. They ask for dresses less shiny, less extravagant, dresses that they can show in a little group.
The French fashion house Chanel chose an intimate family-like atmosphere for its Spring-Summer 2021 show. Models started under flower arches at a socially distanced presentation with a few famous faces. Actresses including Penelope Cruz, Marion Cotillard, and Lily Rose Depp, all Chanel ambassadors, watched from spaced-out chairs as models walked down the steps of Paris's Grand Palace onto the catwalk filled with petals and fairy lights. Floral patterns adorned designer Virginie Vacard creations, embroidered on lace tops or stitched onto dresses. Models also wore floral crowns on their heads. The show closed with the traditional Chanel bride arriving on a horse and dressed in the 1920s style long button satin dress before Vacard waved to the socially distanced audience.
It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. US plane maker Boeing says it will not be able to deliver its first 777X wide-body aircraft until 2023. The decision was announced during the company's fourth quarter financial results of 2020. In a statement, Boeing said the first delivery of the 777X was earlier scheduled for late last year, but the pandemic and the aftermath of a safety crisis over its 737 MAX has pushed it further to 2023. This delay in the delivery program has cost the plane maker a record $6.4 billion. The company's net loss has jumped to $8.4 billion from over $1 billion in the fourth quarter of 2019. U.S. stocks have fallen sharply as investors pour through mixed earnings from major companies. Boeing fell more than 3% after its earnings report showed a record annual loss. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is trading lower by about 1.5%, while the S&P 500 and Nasdaq Composite dropped by about 2%. Meanwhile, oil prices were steady as industry data showed U.S. crude stockpiles fell unexpectedly last week. China reported its lowest daily rise in COVID-19 infections, bolstering hopes of a pickup in demand. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.